The night my grandfather's lawyer called, I was kneeling on my own kitchen floor with a flashlight in my teeth, trying to figure out why the dishwasher had started making a sound like a dying animal. My name is Daniel, and I want you to remember that image, because it matters later. A 34-year-old man on his knees in his own kitchen, covered in dish soap and self-loathing, while his wife stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching him fail at something she'd already decided he'd fail at. "Just call someone," Rachel said. Not annoyed exactly. Something colder than annoyed. Tired. The way you get tired of a leaking faucet you've stopped expecting to get fixed. "I've got it," I said, which was a lie I'd been telling her in one form or another for about 6 years. I was a construction project manager by then, which sounds better than it paid. I'd started as a laborer at 19, worked my way up through 2 companies and a lot of years I don't like to think about too closely, and by the time this story starts I was finally making decent money. Not good money, decent. While Rachel ran marketing for a development firm downtown and made almost double what I did. She never let that fact rest for long. It came out sideways, in comments about restaurants we couldn't afford, in the particular way she said, "We'll see," when I suggested a vacation, in the little pause she left before she said the word contractor when someone asked what I did. The dishwasher had been dying for 2 weeks. I'd already replaced the drain pump once, and now something else had gone, some part one didn't have a name for, grinding somewhere behind the lower rack like a bearing giving out. I had my head under the sink cabinet, one hand on a wrench, trying to trace a hose back to its source, when my phone buzzed on the counter above me. Iowa area code, but not one I recognized. I almost didn't answer it. I've thought about that a lot since, how close I came to just letting it ring. "Mr. Cole? This is Andrew Pell. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Walter Cole." I sat back on my heels so fast I hit my head on the underside of the counter. Walter Cole was my grandfather, a man I'd seen maybe 11 times in my life. Most of them before I turned 12, most of them blurred together into a general memory of a quiet man with grease under his fingernails and a scrapyard that smelled like rust and diesel and something faintly sweet underneath, like old oil gone rancid in the sun. My father, and he hadn't spoken in decades over something nobody in my family would explain to me. Some old wound that had scarred over into silence long before I was old enough to ask about it. I knew he'd run that scrapyard outside Des Moines until his knees gave out. I did not know, until that phone call, that he'd quietly sold 60 acres of land bordering the yard to a logistics company 8 years earlier, and that the money had been sitting in investment accounts ever since, growing, waiting, while the rest of us assumed the old man was scraping by on Social Security and stubbornness. "He passed away Tuesday," the lawyer said, his voice careful in the specific way lawyers' voices get careful when they're about to say a number. "You're named in the will. I'd like to schedule a call to go over the specifics, but I can tell you now the estate is valued at approximately $2.3 million, and the majority of it comes to you." I didn't say anything for a long moment. The wrench was still in my hand. Rachel was still standing in the doorway, phone forgotten in her own hand, watching me with the mild irritation of someone waiting for her husband to get off a call so he could get back to fixing the dishwasher she'd already decided he'd failed to fix. "Okay," I said into the phone, in a voice that didn't sound like mine. "Okay, thank you." I hung up. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Who was that?" I looked at her for a second too long before I answered, and something about the way I looked at her, I didn't understand it myself yet, not fully, made her uncross her arms. "Wrong number," I said. I don't fully know why I lied. I've turned that moment over more times than I can count in the 2 years since, trying to find the exact second the decision got made, trying to catch myself in the act of becoming someone who kept things from his wife. I think some part of me, some old, tired, quiet part that had been keeping a ledger for a long time without telling the rest of me, already knew I wasn't going to hand this to her the way I'd handed her everything else. Every raise, every promotion, every small victory I'd carried home like an offering, hoping it would finally be enough. Rachel went back to whatever she'd been doing before the phone rang. I stayed under the sink another 20 minutes, not because the dishwasher needed me there, but because I needed somewhere to put my face where she couldn't see it. Married 9 years by then, together 12, one daughter, Lily, 6 years old, all elbows and questions, asleep down the hall while her parents' whole world quietly rearranged itself in the kitchen without her knowing. I want you to hold on to that number, 6 years old, because everything that happens in this story happens with a child 3 rooms away, and that fact sat underneath every decision I made from that night forward, whether I said it out loud or not. I finally got the dishwasher running again around 11. Rachel had already gone to bed. I stood in the kitchen a long time after that, the machine humming through its cycle, and I looked around at the house we'd built together. The granite countertop she'd insisted on and I'd financed with a loan I was still paying off. The school photo of Lily on the fridge, the calendar with Rachel's work trips marked in blue ink and my job sites marked in nothing at all, because nobody in this house had ever thought my schedule was worth writing down. $2.3 million. The number didn't feel real. It felt like something that belonged to somebody else's life, a life where a man's grandfather left him enough money to matter, instead of the life I actually had, where I fixed dishwashers at midnight and absorbed small cruelties at breakfast and told myself that was just what marriage cost. I went to bed. I lay next to my wife in the dark, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like the smaller person in that bed. We'd met in college, in Iowa City. Both of us broke in the specific, hopeful way college kids are broke, the kind that feels temporary, that comes with an unspoken promise that it will get better, that this is just the beginning of something. Rachel grew up in a trailer outside Waterloo with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who wasn't around long enough to matter, who left when Rachel was 9 and came back twice after that, each time worse than the last. She never talked about it much, but when she did, her voice went flat in a way that told me more than her words did, a flatness I mistook, for years, for strength. She'd clawed her way to a marketing degree and a life that looked nothing like the one she came from, and I understood, in the early years, that this mattered to her more than almost anything. I admired it. I still do, in a strange, complicated way that survives even everything that happened after. What I didn't understand, not then, was how much that clawing had hardened into something permanent underneath the surface of her. A low hum of fear that never fully turned off, no matter how much distance she put between herself and that trailer. I used to think it was ambition. I know now it was closer to dread, a fear so old it had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like personality. For the first 3 years we were fine, even good. We had almost nothing, and somehow that made it easier. There was no gap yet between what she thought she deserved and what I could provide, because neither of us had anything to compare ourselves against except each other. Then I got laid off from a construction job during a slow stretch in the industry, and for 11 months I picked up whatever work I could find. Day labor, a stint moving furniture, 2 months hanging drywall for a guy who paid in cash, and always a little late. While Rachel carried us on her salary from an entry-level marketing job she'd just landed. That was when it started. Small things at first, things I told myself I was imagining. She stopped introducing me as my husband. He's in construction at her office parties and started saying he's between things right now, instead, in a tone that made it sound less like a career stage and more like a diagnosis. I remember standing at one of those parties holding a beer I didn't want, listening to her explain me to a colleague like I wasn't standing 3 feet away, watching the colleague's face do the polite, pitying thing that people's faces do when they've just been handed information they don't know what to do with. I didn't ask her to stop. That's the first thing I'd tell you now, if you asked me what I'd do differently. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't notice. I noticed everything, filed every comment away in some back room of myself I didn't visit very often, but because some part of me had already decided I didn't have the right to ask for better treatment until I'd earned it, until the numbers on my paycheck matched the numbers she seemed to think a man ought to produce. I told myself I was being patient. Looking back, I was being a doormat and calling it patience, because the truth was easier to carry that way. By the time Lily was born, 6 years into the marriage, I had climbed back, steady work, then the project manager title, real money, just not real enough, apparently, because Rachel's contempt didn't go away with the raise. If anything, it sharpened, because now there was a specific number attached to it, a number she could compare against her own and find wanting. She'd glance at the balance in our joint account and say things like, "This is what you call progress," in a voice that managed to sound almost affectionate, almost like a joke, except it never quite landed as one. She started keeping a separate account I wasn't supposed to know about. I found out by accident, going through old mail looking for a tax document 18 months before the inheritance call, And I remember standing in our garage with a bank statement in my hand, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that I didn't have a name for yet. 4 figures, then 5, growing steadily, fed by transfers from her paycheck that never touched our shared budget. I didn't ask her about it. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation, a surprise for Lily, savings for a trip, something generous hiding behind the secrecy. I wanted, badly, to believe that. Something shifted inside me that day in the garage, quiet and unremarked, like a hairline crack forming in a foundation nobody's checked in years. I couldn't have told you what it meant at the time. I just knew that from then on, some part of me was keeping score, even while the rest of me kept smiling and paying the mortgage and telling myself I was the reasonable one in this marriage, the patient one, the one who didn't make things harder than they needed to be. Around this same period, I wouldn't understand the timeline until much later. Rachel had started working closely with a new client at her firm, a developer named Marcus Reyes, 41, running a downtown revitalization project that was, by her account at the dinner table, the biggest thing her company had landed in years. She talked about him constantly in those early months. Marcus thinks. Marcus wants. Marcus's vision for the riverfront district. I nodded along the way you nod along to any spouse's work gossip, filing it under boring rather than significant, because why would I think otherwise? She talked about half her clients that way. It was just how she got excited about her job. Looking back now, that excitement had a different texture than the excitement she brought home about other accounts. I didn't clock it then. I clock it now. The inheritance call came 4 months after I found that statement in the garage. And the lie I told her that first night, wrong number, turned out to be the first stone in a wall I would spend the next several weeks building, one quiet decision at a time, without ever fully admitting to myself that I was building anything at all. I met with Andrew Pell alone, twice, driving the 2 hours to Des Moines and back without telling Rachel where I'd gone, telling her instead that a job site needed extra supervision. I opened a new account, in my name only, at a bank across town where Rachel had never set foot, where nobody would recognize either of our names. I signed the paperwork transferring the first tranche of funds into it with hands that felt like they belonged to somebody more decisive than I actually was. I walked through my grandfather's scrapyard one gray afternoon, the same rust and diesel smell I remembered from childhood, trying to feel something appropriate for a man I'd barely known and mostly just feeling exhausted. And something else underneath the exhaustion I didn't want to look at too closely, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. At home, I kept fixing dishwashers. I kept absorbing small comments about restaurants and vacations we supposedly couldn't afford, all while a number large enough to erase every one of those comments sat quietly accruing interest in an account she didn't know existed. I told myself I was protecting something, though I couldn't yet have said what. Looking back, I think I already knew. I think some part of me had decided, somewhere in that scrapyard, that I was done handing this woman anything else to hold over me. The thing about deciding to hide something is that it makes you start noticing everything you trained yourself not to see. Rachel had been working with Marcus Reyes for close to 8 months by the time my suspicion sharpened into something with edges. The riverfront project had grown, expanded, become the kind of account that justified late nights and out-of-town site visits and a level of access to her calendar that I'd never had reason to question before. I want to be clear, I wasn't looking for anything at first. I was just paying attention differently, in the specific, hyper-alert way people pay attention once they've started keeping secrets of their own. Guilt makes you a better observer. Nobody tells you that. I noticed she'd started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running, a habit that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. I noticed a new perfume, subtle, floral in a way that wasn't her. Not the drugstore brand she'd worn for a decade. Something with a heavier, more expensive weight to it that showed up on her scarf, but never on the bottles in our bathroom cabinet. I noticed that team dinners had gotten later and more frequent, stretching from occasional to weekly, and that she'd started angling her phone screen away from me at the kitchen table, a small motion, barely a flinch, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it, a habit she'd have denied under oath if I'd asked her about it directly. I told myself it was work stress. The riverfront project was high profile, high pressure, the kind of account that could make or break a career at her level. I told myself a lot of things that spring, most of them constructed specifically to let me keep sleeping at night. I want to stop here for a second, Because if you've ever caught yourself explaining away a dozen small things one at a time, telling yourself each one was nothing on its own, you already know where this is going, and you already know why I kept doing it anyway. It's not stupidity. It's that looking directly at it would have cost more than I was ready to pay, and some part of me had already spent everything I had on the secret I was keeping myself. One Saturday in April, Lily had a swim lesson Rachel was supposed to take her to. Rachel canceled at the last minute, citing a client emergency with the Reyes project, apologetic in a rushed, distracted way that didn't quite match the words. I took Lily instead, sat through 40 minutes of watching 6-year-olds attempt to float, and in the parking lot afterward, buckling her into her car seat, I saw Rachel's car, the actual car, unmistakable, the small dent in the rear bumper from a snowbank 2 winters back, parked outside a hotel on the west side of town, nowhere near her office, nowhere near any job site of Marcus Reyes's I was aware of. I didn't confront her. I sat in my own car outside the swim school with my 6-year-old singing something tuneless in the back seat, and I felt the ground tilt slightly under me, the way it does right before you understand something you already knew but hadn't let yourself say. That detail seemed insignificant in the moment. A car in a parking lot. Nothing more, easily explained by any of a dozen ordinary things. It wasn't insignificant. It was the first hard thing my hands could actually hold. I started documenting, not out of some cold strategic instinct, at least that's not how it felt from the inside, but because I didn't trust my own mind anymore to keep track of what was real and what I'd invented out of fear. I photographed the hotel, the timestamp on my phone. Over the following weeks, I checked our credit card statements, an account she still didn't know I had full access to, and found a pattern. Charges at that same hotel going back for months. Always on Thursdays. Always clustered around lunch hour. Always small enough that they'd have blended into the noise of a normal budget if I hadn't already been looking for them. For months. The affair, if that's what this was, had apparently started roughly the same time I found that hidden bank account in the garage. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Rachel had been building her own exit for longer than I wanted to admit, and I think some tired, unspoken part of both of us had been quietly leaving the marriage in parallel for a long time before either of us said a word about it out loud. I still remember exactly how it felt sitting in that parking lot with the engine off. Even now, something in my chest tightens when I think about it. Not rage, not yet, not that first day. Just the specific, hollow disorientation of realizing the person across the dinner table from you every night has been living a second life you weren't invited into, running on a schedule you'd never have guessed if you hadn't happened to be in the wrong parking lot at the right time. I didn't say anything that night. I made dinner. I helped Lily with her spelling words at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this would eventually come to a head. I lay next to Rachel in bed and listened to her breathing even out into sleep, and I stared at the ceiling, turning the last 4 months over in my mind like a stone I couldn't stop rubbing between my fingers, looking for a smooth side that wasn't there. I want to pause here, because if you've ever lain in bed next to someone, listening to them sleep, doing math on their absences in your head, you know this specific kind of loneliness. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits down next to you in the dark and waits. She told me, much later, what those months had actually felt like from her side of it. I didn't know any of this yet. Not that night, not for weeks after. But this is what she was carrying, underneath the version of her I was watching sleep beside me. I told myself it was just lunch, the first time. Marcus made me feel like I mattered in a way that had nothing to do with money, even though obviously it had everything to do with money. That's the part one couldn't say out loud, even to myself back then. I kept thinking, this is temporary. This is just until things feel less scary. I grew up watching my mother count change at a gas station register, and I swore I'd never live like that. And here I was married to a man who fixed his own dishwasher at midnight because we couldn't afford to call anyone, and it made something in me go quiet and cold every single time I watched him under that sink. Marcus never made me feel like that. Sitting across from him felt like the opposite of everything I grew up in. I told myself I deserved one thing in my life that didn't feel like survival. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. Over the next several weeks, the small signs kept accumulating, each one a little sharper than the last. She started leaving her phone face down on the counter instead of face up, a habit that hadn't existed before that spring. Once, reaching past her to grab a mug from the cabinet, I saw her flinch, a full-body flinch, quick and involuntary, the kind of reaction that belongs to someone braced for a question she doesn't have an answer to. She laughed about it, brushed it off as being startled, but I filed it away with everything else, another brick in a wall I hadn't fully admitted I was building. By early June, the pattern had escalated into something I couldn't keep filing under work stress. She came home from one of the team dinners smelling like that same floral perfume, but underneath it, faint and unmistakable if you'd smelled it as many times as I had, cigarette smoke. Something Marcus Reyes, according to her own dinner table stories, smoked on the balcony during breaks in negotiations. Rachel didn't smoke. She never had. She showered before bed that night, something she rarely did, standing under the water for what felt, from the bedroom, like a very long time. I want to be honest about something, because if I don't tell you the parts I'm not proud of, none of the rest of this means anything. I made at least one decision in those weeks that I regret, even now, even knowing how things ended. I hired a private investigator, a retired cop named Gary Holt, working out of a strip mall office on the east side that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and printer toner, without ever once considering going to a marriage counselor first, without ever sitting Rachel down and simply asking her directly what was happening. I chose surveillance over conversation. I told myself it was because I needed proof before I said anything, that I couldn't risk her lying her way out of an accusation I couldn't back up with something solid. The truer answer, the one I've had to sit with since, is that some part of me had already decided the marriage was over and simply hadn't told the rest of me yet. Gary's office became a place I could go be certain, instead of a place I had to go be honest. Gary confirmed what I already suspected within 2 weeks. The hotel, Marcus Reyes, a pattern that had clearly been going on far longer than 4 months, closer to a year, predating even the moment I'd found that separate bank account in the garage. Which meant the two things I'd assumed were connected, her fear of poverty and her affair, weren't cause and effect in the order I'd imagined. She hadn't started hiding money because of the affair. She'd started the affair and the hidden account around the same period her firm first landed the Reyes account, a full year before I ever found that statement. That realization landed harder than the affair itself, if I'm honest. Looking back, that was the moment I understood this wasn't a single betrayal I could isolate, grieve, and move past. It was an entire second architecture she'd been quietly building underneath our life for a long time, brick by brick, while I stood in the kitchen fixing appliances and believing, with a kind of willful stubbornness I'm not proud of, that patience was the same thing as love. There was a false lead in there too, one that cost me nearly a week of sick, misdirected suspicion. I found a text on a shared family tablet, the one Lily used for her reading app, from an unfamiliar number that just said, "Did you tell him yet?" I spent days convinced it was Marcus, pressuring Rachel to leave me, maybe even threatening her. I built an entire narrative in my head around that single text, a narrative where Rachel was somehow the reluctant one, being pushed toward a decision she didn't want to make. It wasn't Marcus. It was Rachel's sister Beth, who I eventually learned had known about the affair for months and had been quietly, uselessly urging Rachel to end it before someone, meaning me, meaning Lily, got hurt. Beth wasn't complicit in any deliberate sense. She was trapped in the specific, exhausting misery of loving two people who were lying to each other, unable to betray her sister's confidence, but increasingly sick over what that silence was costing everyone around her. I found this out weeks later, in a conversation that started with me showing up at her apartment unannounced, holding a printout of that text message, demanding to know what she'd meant by it. She told me everything then, not gladly, not easily, but with the relief of someone finally allowed to put down something heavy she'd been carrying for too long. I don't fully forgive her for the silence, but I understand it, in the way you understand things you'd probably have done yourself in her position. Then everything changed, not the affair itself, which stayed exactly the same, hidden and Thursday-shaped and cold according to Gary's continued reports, but Rachel changed. Almost overnight. It started about 6 weeks after the inheritance call, right around when I'd quietly finalized moving the money into an irrevocable trust with an attorney of my own, someone Andrew Pell had recommended specifically because he understood Iowa's laws on separate property inside a marriage better than anyone else in the state. Rachel started coming home earlier. She planned a surprise date night, dinner at a restaurant we'd never been able to justify, a bottle of wine she picked out herself, the first surprise anything she'd organized in 3 years. She stopped taking the Thursday hotel charges. Gary confirmed the pattern broke entirely that same week, replaced by nothing, no new pattern at all, as if that entire part of her life had simply been switched off. She told me, unprompted, over dinner one night, that she'd been thinking a lot lately about how hard I'd worked over the years, how she hadn't always shown appreciation, how she wanted to do better, be better, starting now. I sat across the table from her, listening to an apology I'd waited 9 years to hear, and I understood with a kind of total, sick clarity that it had nothing to do with me at all. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever had someone become suddenly kind to you the exact moment they found out you had something they wanted, you know exactly how that feels. It doesn't feel like love arriving late. It feels like being appraised, like standing very still while someone recalculates your value. I hadn't told her about the inheritance. I was certain of that, careful about it in a way that had cost me real effort. But Cedar Rapids is a smaller city than people think, and Andrew Pell's firm handled enough local estate work that word travels through circles that eventually touch other circles, no matter how careful anyone tries to be. I later confirmed, through nothing more elegant than Beth, who finally told me the whole truth once she realized how much I already knew, that a mutual friend's husband worked in wealth management downtown and had mentioned, in passing conversation at some gathering neither Rachel nor I had attended, that Daniel Cole's inheritance had come through the Pell firm, and roughly what it was worth. It reached Rachel within days. She never told me she knew. She simply began, quietly and skillfully, becoming a different wife, warmer, more attentive, more present than she'd been in years. All of it calibrated, I would eventually understand, to a number she believed she was still entitled to share in. That was the moment I finally understood what my own denial had actually been protecting me from all those months. Not from finding out about Marcus. I'd already found out about Marcus. From finding out that even now, faced with real proof of who she was, some old and stubborn part of me still wanted her sudden warmth to be real. Wanted it badly enough to almost let it work. I want to name the pattern here because I think it matters. Red flag after red flag. And each time I found a reasonable-sounding explanation to hang it on instead of the true one. The perfume was stress. The flinch was being startled. The hidden account was a surprise she was planning. The sudden kindness was growth. Every single time, I chose the version of events that let me keep standing in that kitchen a little longer, and every single time, the true version had been sitting right there the whole time, waiting for me to stop negotiating with it. I didn't confront her the night I finally understood the shape of what was happening. I waited 3 more weeks, and I used them the way Gary had taught me, quietly, methodically, without tipping my hand. I documented every hotel charge, every changed pattern, every unprompted kindness that lined up suspiciously with the timeline of my inheritance becoming public knowledge in circles she moved through. I met with my attorney twice more to confirm the trust was airtight. I made sure that under Iowa law, the inheritance would remain entirely mine, untouchable by any divorce settlement, regardless of what happened next in the marriage. Then, on a Tuesday evening in October, after Lily was asleep, I set a folder on the kitchen table, the same table where Rachel had once told a colleague I was between things, the same table where I'd helped Lily sound out spelling words while quietly falling apart inside, and asked Rachel to sit down. "I need to show you something," I said. I laid it out the way you'd lay out a case, because that's exactly what it was, and because Gary had taught me that the order matters, that you build slowly, so there's no room left to argue by the time you're done. The hotel photograph first, timestamp visible in the corner. Then the credit card statements, months of Thursday charges highlighted in yellow, a pattern that couldn't be explained away as anything but what it was. Then Gary's report itself, printed and stapled, dates and times, and a name. Marcus Reyes, typed in plain black and white where she couldn't argue with it or reframe it into something smaller. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her outright, not yet. I just placed each piece down on the table, one at a time, and waited for her to catch up to what I already knew. "Here's what I know," I said, "and here's what doesn't add up. I'd like you to explain it." Her face didn't collapse the way I might have imagined, in some earlier, more hopeful version of myself, some version that had still believed, right up until that moment, that she loved me more than she feared going broke. It went still instead, careful, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math behind their eyes. "This is insane," she said, her voice climbing just slightly. "Where did you even get this? Did you have someone following me? Do you understand how insane that is, Daniel? Having someone follow your own wife." "How long?" I said. "It's not what you think it is." "How long, Rachel?" She stood up, paced to the sink, ran the tap for a second without filling anything, turned it off, came back. "Marcus and I had dinner a few times to talk about the project. It got complicated. It's not. It wasn't serious. It wasn't what these photos are trying to make it look like. I have hotel charges going back 11 months. Those could be anything, Daniel. Business meetings run late. You don't understand how this industry works. You're taking a handful of coincidences and building this whole story out of them." "Rachel," I kept my voice level. "It cost me more than she knew to keep it that way, more than I let show. I'm not asking you to confirm something I'm unsure of. I already know. I'm asking if you're capable of being honest with me one single time, after 9 years, while I'm sitting right here in front of you." She went quiet for a moment, and I let myself think, briefly, stupidly, that this was it, that she was finally about to tell me the truth without me having to drag every inch of it out of her. Instead, she shifted again, smaller this time, more careful, testing a new angle. "Fine. We got close. It didn't mean what you think it meant. People get close to people at work. It happens. It's not some grand affair. You're acting like I ran off and married the man." Every time she moved her version of events, I felt the folder in front of me get a little heavier, a little more solid, like something being built rather than something being torn apart. I didn't fill the silences. I let her keep talking, keep adjusting, keep offering smaller and smaller admissions dressed up as honesty, and I understood, watching her do it in real time, that this was probably how she'd survived every hard conversation of her entire life. Reframe. Minimize. Wait for the other person to get tired of pushing before they get all the way to the truth. I didn't get tired. "I know about the account you opened 4 years ago," I said. "I know the timeline lines up almost exactly with when this started. And I know you started being kind to me again the same week people at a mutual friend's dinner party found out about my grandfather's estate." For the first time, something in her face actually cracked. Not into tears, not yet, but into a flicker of something like fear, quick and involuntary. There and then gone. The same kind of flinch I'd caught once before, reaching past her for a mug. That has nothing to do with, doesn't it?" She didn't answer that. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than any of the accusations either of us had said out loud. Heavier even than the folder itself. I gathered the papers, squared the edges of them, and stood up. "I'm not going to fight about this tonight," I said. "I need you to know I'm not confused about what happened. And I need you to know that whatever you decide to do next, it's not going to be based on money you thought you were still entitled to." I walked out to the garage, the same garage where I'd found that bank statement over a year earlier, though I don't think I made that connection consciously in the moment. Not to destroy anything, just to be somewhere she wasn't. I sat in the dark on an overturned bucket for a long time, listening to my own heartbeat slow down, the smell of motor oil and cut lumber settling around me like something almost familiar, almost safe. Even now, when I think back to that night, something in my chest still tightens, not for what she did, but for how long I'd let myself believe her stillness, all those years, had meant peace instead of distance. Rachel came to me 11 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, while Lily was at Beth's house for the weekend. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table, and this time there was no folder between us, nothing but her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she never once drank from. "I want to tell you the truth," she said. "All of it. Not the version I gave you before." I nodded and let her talk. She told me everything. In her words, it started small. There was a night after a site walkthrough, raining hard, and Marcus offered to buy me a drink while we waited it out at the hotel bar near the project. I remember sitting there thinking, this is the first time in years someone's asked me what I wanted instead of what we could afford. That's how it started. Not romance, at least not at first, just relief. I told myself it was one drink, that it meant nothing, that I could have one thing in my life that didn't feel like survival. Then it was dinner. Then it was the hotel, and I told myself that was the last time too. Every single time, right up until it wasn't the last time anymore. I kept telling myself I deserved it, that you'd checked out of really seeing me years earlier, that this was something separate from our marriage, its own contained thing that didn't touch the rest. But it wasn't contained. It got bigger every month, and I got better at lying every month right along with it. I was terrified of being caught, terrified of losing everything I'd spent my whole life building, and underneath that, terrified of who I was becoming and doing it anyway. Every Thursday, like clockwork. There were nights I'd come home and look at Lily's drawings on the fridge, and I couldn't stand still in the kitchen long enough to look at them straight on. When I heard about the inheritance, I told myself I was being warmer to you because I felt guilty. That was a lie too. I was scared, Daniel. I grew up with nothing, and I spent my whole life terrified of going back to nothing. And somewhere in there I decided that fear mattered more than being honest with the person I actually married. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I didn't feel the relief I might once have expected to feel. Hearing this confession I'd waited months to hear. I felt tired, mostly, and something close to sad for both of us. For the version of us that might have survived any of this, if either of us had said any of it 5 years earlier, before the lying calcified into a whole second life underneath the first one, invisible and load-bearing. I'm not staying, I told her. I want you to hear that clearly, because I don't think you fully believe it yet. She cried then, quietly. No begging, no bargaining. I think some part of her had already known, walking into that kitchen that Sunday afternoon, that this conversation wasn't going to end any other way, whatever she said, however completely she finally told the truth. The divorce took 7 months. My attorney's work on the trust held exactly the way it was supposed to. The inheritance stayed entirely mine, untouched by the settlement, protected under Iowa law as separate property regardless of when it arrived during the marriage. The settlement itself, given the documented affair and the dissipation of marital assets she'd been quietly funneling into that separate account for years, went in my favor in almost every meaningful way. I kept the house. I got primary custody of Lily, with Rachel maintaining regular, structured visitation. Marcus Reyes, once his own wife found out, through channels that had nothing to do with me, small cities being what they are, lost his marriage, and eventually his contract with Rachel's firm once the affair became something colleagues whispered about at the coffee machine instead of a secret anyone still bothered protecting. Rachel kept her job, technically, but not her reputation in the professional circles that had once mattered so much to her, and not the man she'd risked everything to be with. I didn't gloat. There wasn't any real satisfaction in watching two people lose things. There was just a kind of quiet, settled clarity, the sense of a door finally closing on a room I'd been standing in far too long, waiting for permission to leave that I'd finally stopped asking for. I used part of the inheritance to start my own small contracting company. I named it after my grandfather, a man I'd barely known, who somehow, without ever once explaining himself to me while he was alive, changed the entire trajectory of my life from beyond it. I think about that sometimes, how a stranger's quiet decision, made years before I ever knew about it, undid 9 years of somebody else's quiet unkindness, and how strange it is that the thing that finally set me free came from a man I could barely picture clearly. I understand now that I wasn't building a marriage for most of those 9 years. I was maintaining the appearance of one, and telling myself that was the same thing, because the appearance was easier to keep intact than the real thing would have required me to be. I mistook not asking questions for patience and tolerance for love, and I let contempt sit at my dinner table year after year because I didn't believe I'd earned the right to object to it until my paycheck said otherwise. That's not really a lesson about Rachel. That's a lesson about me, and it's the one I carry hardest, even now. The most painful detail in this story isn't the hotel, or the money, or even the affair itself. It's the 11 days between the confrontation and the confession, when Rachel already knew the marriage was over and still chose to keep managing the truth in small, careful doses, because even facing total loss, controlling the narrative felt safer to her than simply being known. That instinct, to manage rather than to reveal, is the thread that runs through everything she did, long before Marcus, long before the money. It's what the trailer outside Waterloo taught her, years before Daniel ever met her. That vulnerability gets you left, and control keeps you fed. What's easy to miss, if you only look at Daniel's suffering, is that Rachel's fear was real, even if her response to it was a betrayal. Poverty leaves marks that don't disappear Just because the bank account eventually improves, it rewires what a person believes they're allowed to ask for out loud, and what they believe they have to secure quietly, alone, without trusting anyone else to protect it for them. That doesn't excuse what she did to Daniel. It explains it, which is a very different thing, and the story is more honest for holding both truths at once instead of flattening her into a simple villain standing opposite a simple victim. The real turning point in this story wasn't the parking lot outside the swim school, and it wasn't the folder on the kitchen table. It was the moment, over a year earlier, when Daniel found that hidden bank account in the garage and said nothing about it. That's the moment two people, independently and without ever discussing it, quietly decided their marriage wasn't a place they could bring the truth anymore. Everything that came after, the affair, the surveillance, the folder, the confession, was just the slow unfolding of a decision that had already been made in silence, long before either of them would have called it a decision at all. This story ultimately isn't about money changing everything, even though that's the shape it takes on the surface. The money didn't change Rachel. It revealed her, the same way the inheritance revealed something in Daniel too, a willingness, finally, after 9 years, to stop absorbing contempt and start protecting himself. Betrayal doesn't usually announce itself with any drama. It accumulates in small, unspoken agreements to look away, one Thursday, one silence, one unopened bank statement at a time, until the day it simply doesn't fit in the dark anymore, and everything that was hidden has to become visible all at once. Which raises the question worth sitting with long after this particular story ends. How many of us are keeping some version of that same silent ledger right now, mistaking it for patience, telling ourselves we're being kind or reasonable or mature, when we're really just afraid of finding out what happens if we finally say the thing out loud? I think about that kitchen table more than almost any other place in my life. The same table where she once explained me away to a stranger at a party years earlier. The same table where I laid out a folder that ended a marriage. The same table where she finally told me the truth 11 days too late to change anything. Tables hold a lot more than dinner, if you let them. What stays with me now isn't anger. It's the quiet understanding that I spent 9 years believing love meant absorbing whatever someone handed me without complaint, and it took losing everything to learn that isn't love at all. It's just exhaustion, wearing love's clothes so well that even I couldn't tell the difference for a long time. If you've ever caught yourself explaining away someone's coldness as they're just stressed, or that's just how they are, I'd gently ask you to sit with that a little longer than I did. I waited 9 years. I don't recommend it. If there's someone who let you down the way this let me down, or a moment you saw the red flag clearly and looked away from it anyway, tell me one word for it in the comments below. Just one word. I read every single one, and more of you than you'd think are carrying something similar tonight, even if you've never said it out loud until now. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way to the end. This story cost me something to tell honestly, and I'm genuinely grateful you were here for it.